It may seem rather unnecessary that I should start off by telling you what the Old Testament is. But the difficulty with the Old Testament is that outside the Jewish community, most people have never read it and therefore have no idea what it contains. And then there have been ways of talking about the Old Testament that have really not done it much credit. For example, the common one is the Old Testament is about a God of wrath, as opposed to the New Testament that is supposed to be about a God of love. But more insidiously, they developed in the 19th century in Victorian Britain in response to Darwinism, a view that saw the Old Testament as what was called the record of a progressive revelation, a progressive educating of God, whereby Israel was drawn from lower views of the nature of God and morality to higher views of the nature of God and morality, culminating in the coming of Christ. And the trouble with that approach was, first of all, it concentrated attention on the process that the Old Testament was supposed to be witnessing to, rather than the actual text. And of course, if the whole thing comes to fruition with Christ, why do you need the preliminaries? So this idea, which started off in Victorian Britain, took very deep root in Britain in the last century, and still has a little bit of residue, is really an extremely unhelpful and, as we now know, unscholarly way of reading the Old Testament. So I start off on paragraph 1 of the handout by saying that the Old Testament is a library. And it's a library that owes its existence to what I call a special relationship. A special relationship between ancient Israel and the God of Israel, but a special relationship that was designed that through Israel, all the nations of the world should come to know and acknowledge God. And the cosmic aims are there that in that knowing and acknowledging God, the human race would exercise a responsible stewardship in the world that God had created. So we're dealing with a special relationship. And paragraph 2, its foundational narratives center on the persons I've named there: Abraham, Jacob, Moses, and David. Now, these were originally, of course, historical figures, but their existence is back in the far distance of time, and we know them because they have what I call here narrative existence. They drew to themselves a variety of different traditions, ideas, stories, and these narratives were told and retold and honed, and became then not so much historical figures as figures that represented the outcome of the encounter between God and his people. And that encounter had various features that we see repeated time and again in the stories about Abraham and Jacob and so on. Because it begins with a divine initiative. It begins with a divine offer. An offer that is gracious. An offer that is generous. An offer that has mind-boggling implications, such that the response of ordinary people is, and I list some of these things at the bottom of paragraph 2, responses that are thankful, sympathetic, loyal, rebellious, fearful, ignorant, selfish, fragile. That indeed is one of the tremendous values of the Old Testament. It tells the story of the people of God as a people, thankful, sympathetic, loyal, rebellious, fearful, ignorant, selfish, and fragile. And to that extent is a mirror or an anticipation of the church as Christians try to respond again to God's gracious and amazing offer. So we look now in some of the next paragraphs at how that relationship works out through the characters who have been given this narrative existence by the cultural memory of ancient Israel. Well, Abraham is the supreme example of a divine initiative because God promises descendants to a couple who are long past the age of childbearing. I think Abraham is 99 and Sarah is 90, something like that. And Abraham trusts in God's promise and yet then goes back on it. He tries to get an heir through having a child through his wife's maid, a nice early example of surrogacy, about which we hear a lot these days. And he is not always acting in a responsible way. For example, when he and his wife are threatened, he pretends that she's not actually his wife at all. So he's not a credit, really, to the person who has believed and trusted in God's promises until we get to that amazing chapter in the book of Genesis, chapter 22, the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. A story that caused enormous problems to the Victorians with their idea of progressive revelation. How on earth, the Victorians asked, could anybody believe that a man was being asked by God actually to sacrifice his own son? And they solved that problem by saying, well, of course, it must have been somebody who had a very primitive idea of God and a very undeveloped idea of human personality. I mean, a total misreading of one of the most profound chapters of the Old Testament. Because it shows that Abraham, in spite of all his difficulties and confusions, has reached the point by Genesis 22 where he is prepared to trust God to the point even of sacrificing the son who is the center of all the promises that have been made. And of course, in the event, it is God himself who provides the way out. Then we move to Jacob, a trickster who cheats his brother out of his birthright, out of his father's blessing, who cheats his uncle out of his flocks and herds, and finally his household gods. And yet, before he becomes, or as he becomes the ancestor of the 12 tribes of Israel, the encounter between God and Jacob brings about a change in him. And there is a very moving prayer that comes just before another mysterious incident of Jacob wrestling with, well, is it an angel? Is it a man? Is it God? In Genesis chapter 32. And Jacob prays this prayer: O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return unto thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant. For with my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now I am become 2 bands. Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he will come and smite me and the mother with the children. And thou saidst, I will surely do thee good, and make thy seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. And whenever I see that prayer, I'm reminded of another prayer that comes in the book of Esther. Now, the book of Esther famously, in its Hebrew version, never mentions God. But there are two versions of the book of Esther. There is a Greek version, which is part of that Greek Bible, which is, of course, Holy Scripture to the Orthodox churches, and a part of the Apocrypha, which for Roman Catholics and sort of for Anglicans is also important. And in the book of Esther, in the Greek version, there is a beautiful prayer that occurs at the point where Esther is going to face the king to tell her of the threat to the Jewish people. And it begins with these beautiful words, "O my Lord, you only are our king. Help me, who am alone and have no helper but you, for my danger is in my hand." And the additions to Esther are some of them extremely beautiful. Well, now we come on to Moses, and the divine initiative in the case of Moses, of course, is expressed by the story of his birth, of course, in the bulrushes, surviving the threat of the extermination of all the baby boys. And his ministry is a sign of what happens when you accept the divine mission and how right you are to try to avoid God's call. Moses' reluctance is very similar to that of Jeremiah's reluctance. But fundamental to the story of Moses is the fact that the chosen people, the special relationship, have been slaves in Egypt. And that is fundamental to the nature of the people whom God calls to be his own, that they have known what it is to be slaves and to be oppressed, and to be brought out of slavery not for any worthiness of their own, but because of God's grace. In Deuteronomy 7, "The Lord did not set his love upon you nor choose you because ye were more in number than any people, for ye were the fewest of all people. But because the Lord loved you, and because he would keep the oath which he had sworn unto your fathers, hath the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you out of the house of bondmen from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." And that fact of liberation from slavery runs, as I was saying in my sermon last Sunday, runs through the moral, ethical parts of the early books of the Bible. You must remember that you were a slave in Egypt and the Lord redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this today, says God, as he tells the Israelites that if they are going to have to take some people into slavery because of economic failures, that slavery must be limited to 6 years. And when the slave is released, and the woman must be treated in the same way, the slave is to be richly endowed with corn and wine and oil and sheep, so that the slave has a chance of starting again. And it is because of the redemption from slavery that debts are to be cancelled, that interest is not to be charged, that properties are to be returned to people after 50 years. I mean, this theme, this imperative of redemption, runs through the early books of the Bible and is fundamental to the whole self-identity of Israel, that Israel is a people without hope, only, and with hope only, because God set his love upon them. Now, of course, when we come to the story of Moses and the books that are associated with him, especially Numbers, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, we immediately think of the forgiveness of sins in terms of a sacrificial system. And there is a verse in the 9th chapter of the letter to the Hebrews that says that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Now, this is true only in a very, very limited sense. There is a marvelous exposition of the whole sacrificial system of the Old Testament in Bishop Westcott's great commentary on the Greek text of the Epistle to the Hebrews. And Westcott makes this important point. It is necessary to observe that the range of the Levitical atonements, that's the sacrifices, was very narrow. They were confined to bodily impurity, ceremonial offences, sins of ignorance, and then certain specified offences. And this is the crunch point. They did not deal with moral offences as such. They had no relief for high-handed sins. So, whatever else we may make of those words from the letter to the Hebrews, without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness, it is not applicable in the Old Testament to moral offences as such. And that can come as a bit of a shock if one is used to Catholic and Calvinist type thinking about sin and forgiveness in judicial terms, where the sinner is seen as standing in the law court and being declared to be guilty by God. That cannot be supported from the Old Testament at all, and certainly it is not a function of the sacrificial system. So we have to go along a different path, and one of the most remarkable things, it comes in 2 Samuel 12:13. We'll come on to David again in a minute. You remember that David has committed adultery. And David has arranged for the wronged husband to be exposed in battle in the front line and to be killed. And when David has the news that Uriah the Hittite, the husband of Bathsheba, has been killed in battle, after a suitable period, he then takes Bathsheba into his harem. And remember the remarkable chapter 12 of the second book of Samuel, where the prophet Nathan comes and tells to David the parable of the ewe lamb. And David, of course, as it were, condemns himself out of his own mouth. Nathan says to David, "Thou art the man." But then, after all that, and telling David that evil is going to come upon his house because of what he has done, he then says, "The Lord hath put away thy sin." The Hebrew is he'avir, which means really has caused to pass away, has caused your sin to pass away. I mean, there is no sacrifice offered. God has restored the relationship, even though David's acts will have consequences, as we read in the following chapters of the second book of Samuel. And so we move now to David, the man after God's own heart, 1 Samuel 13:14. He it is who rescues the people from the Philistine disaster, founds Jerusalem, becomes the figure for God's future ideal ruler. And yet, as we have seen, he is a character who is deeply flawed. And the remarkable thing about the second book of Samuel is that it does not spare David at all as it relates his unworthiness and all the things that came upon his house and how he dealt with them. Now, I'll come on in a moment to the so-called Psalms of David to see how important they are. But in paragraph 6, I want to say that the narratives about Abraham and all the others, the representatives of the special relationship, are an important counterpart to the narratives in Genesis chapters 1 to 11 about the human and cosmic consequences of human self-assertiveness. Those first 11 chapters are about God's dealings with the human race, a human race that would rather get on without God. And the story of the Tower of Babel, which immediately precedes the narrative about Abraham, is almost the exact opposite of the Israelite experience of being slaves in Egypt. Because in the ancient world, all the great achievements of civilization were built upon slave labor. And when the story in Genesis 11 tells us that they, unspecified people, the people who wanted to build the great city and tower and make a name for themselves, when it says that they baked the bricks, they collected the mortar, it wasn't they who were doing it. These were the slaves and other oppressed peoples who would be engaged in all those building works. So one of the things that happens in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, when human beings think that they can run the world better than God, is that it results in the oppression of some humans by other humans, and that the very heart of the special relationship which is Israel is this experience of having been enslaved, of having been released from slavery, and all the moral and other consequences that flow from that. And so then we come on to number 7, the importance of the Psalms of David. Now, I've put Psalms of David, of course, in inverted commas. Traditionally, Jews and Christians think of David as the author of the Psalms, and of course we know from modern scholarship that that is unlikely to be the case. But the interesting thing about this traditional ascription of the Psalms to David is precisely this. We're talking again about this ideal ruler, the one who is going to prefigures the Messiah. And in the Psalms, this paragon of virtue is portrayed as a fragile man, a man who needs the forgiveness of God, so that we have a whole picture, a whole portrait of David here in the Psalms as one deeply dependent upon God's gracious love and forgiveness. And the greatest expression of all this, of course, comes in Psalm 51. Have mercy upon me, O God, after thy great goodness. According to the multitude of thy mercies, do away mine offences. Wash me thoroughly from my wickedness. Cleanse me from my sin, for I acknowledge my faults, and my sin is ever before me. Against thee only have I sinned, and done this evil in thy sight, that thou mightest be justified in thy saying, and clear when thou art judged. He goes on to say, thou shalt purge me with hyssop, I shall be clean. Thou shalt wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Thou shalt make me hear of joy and gladness, that the bones which thou hast broken may rejoice. Turn thy face from my sins, and put out all my misdeeds. Make me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me. Now, what is going on here is relational, and I shall come back to this in a moment, because then we get to the key verses here, verses 16 and 17. Thou desirest no sacrifice, else would I give it thee, but thou delightest not in burnt offerings. The sacrifice of God is a troubled spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, shalt thou not despise. Now, in the interests of completeness, I should say that verses 18 and 19 then go and say, O be favourable and gracious unto Zion, build thou the walls of Jerusalem, then shalt thou be pleased with the sacrifice of righteousness, and with burnt offerings and oblations, then shall they offer young bullocks upon thine altar. And it is usually said that these are later additions to the psalm. I mean, they may be, they be not. I consulted no less a great authority than Wellhausen on this subject. And Wellhausen doesn't think they are a later addition, but are expressing a different point. That in ancient Israel there is a public, corporate sense with regard to sacrifices that are not there primarily, as Bishop Westcott says, to deal with moral offences, but to deal with ritual offences. They need to go on. But when it comes to personal and moral offences, there is no sacrifice that can be given because God does not want it. And God has his own way of healing the relationship that had been broken. And I was reminded here, of course, of those words that we get in Micah chapter 6, verses 7 to 8. Wherewithal shall I come before the Lord, and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Answer: He has showed thee, O man, what is good. And what doth the Lord require of thee? But to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. So we may have to start getting used to the difficult idea, if we have had our thinking too much framed by Catholic and Calvinist ideas of sin and forgiveness as happening in the law court and there needing to be retribution and so on. We have to get used to the rather strange idea that God restores relationships and forgives in his way, not in our way. And as I say in paragraph 8, I think as I read the Old Testament, and of course it's a little bit misleading perhaps to try to summarize the complexity of the Old Testament into a simple formula, but it seems to me that sin in the Old Testament is about destroying relationships, and sinful acts destroy relationships, and of course betray God's trust. And all that the Old Testament says about sin and forgiveness occurs within the context of the special relationship which God has initiated, human response to the great offer that God makes. So that forgiveness is a personal, it is not a legal and judicial matter. And I couldn't help thinking of two things with which I will come to a conclusion. First of all, Martin Luther, in his Heidelberg Disputation, said in thesis number 28, "The love of God does not find its object, but rather creates it." And then the Canadian social philosopher Charles Taylor, in his book Sources of the Self, says something similar. God's seeing the world as good, loving it, can be conceived not simply as a response to what it is, but as that which makes it such. So if we come back to where we began, with the special relationship, that special relationship exists because God makes it exist. Israel is lovable because God chooses to love it and to have dealings with it in spite of all the difficult and sometimes rebellious responses within the context of that relationship. And that is what must guide our thinking, I believe, as we move on from the Old Testament to the New Testament, because the background to the New Testament is not so much a sacrificial, judicial set of ideas taken from the Old Testament. And if we can read the teaching of Jesus without these preconceptions, we shall be in for some very big surprises to our usual thinking.